Hello and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. On February 20th, 2019, I released the episode of And the Runner-Up Is on the 1974 Best Picture race, where we discussed Chinatown as the likely runner-up that lost Best Picture to The Godfather Part II. But what if it was really Lenny?
Newsweek described his cause of death as an overdose of police.
His obituary in Time magazine said he viewed life as a four-letter word.
Dustin Hoffman, Lenny, a Bob Fosse film.
Hello, and welcome to On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we discuss another Best Picture nominee that we did not cover as the runner-up on the main show. We are back in 1974, and on the main show we talked about Chinatown as the runner-up to The Godfather Part II, and instead we are discussing here whether it might have been Lenny. I have two fabulous guests with me, who I'm very excited to get into it with. My first guest has been on the main show for the Best Picture series many times, including the episode on the first Academy Awards, plus an episode of On Second Thought about The Crying Game, founder of Awards Watch. It's Erik Anderson.
Hello.
Here we are. Are you excited for this?
I am, because I love this year so much. It's like one of the best years of film in the history
Indeed.
of film.
It really is. Well, are we excited to talk about it with my next guest? Let's get to it. He joined me for an episode of the Best Picture series where I forced him to watch not only a Shakespeare adaptation, but a Charles Dickens adaptation. He also joined me for an episode of On Second Thought about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon from Academy Queens and In Session Film. It's Joey Gentile.
I am so much happier to be on this episode where I don't have to talk about Dickens nor Shakespeare, so thank you for that.
You get to talk about comedy.
I do, which is a lot of fun. As you will get to hear,
Yes.
there is a personal connection here, but I get to talk about comedy with a funny person, Kevin, and a court jester, Miss Erik.
Perfect.
Oh, she's a comedy queen today. Let's go.
Already coming in hot. All right. Well, let's just jump right in here. So, Lenny, it is a biopic drama about the life of Lenny Bruce, stand-up comic who was big in the 50s and 60s and was known for his provocative approach to comedy. And the film jumps around between his early career, meeting his wife Honey, having a daughter with her, getting a divorce, having affairs, eventually becoming so provocative in his acts that he gets thrown out of clubs by the police for obscenity, and then ultimately has his eventual drug overdose in 1966. Spoilers for real life. So the film was directed by Bob Fosse and written by Julian Barry, adapting his own play of the same name. It stars Dustin Hoffman as Lenny Bruce, Valerie Perrine as Honey, Jan Miner, Stanley Beck, Rachel Novikov, and Gary Morton. And Lenny made $11 million at the U.S. box office. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, but did not win any of them. So let's start first with, again, the comedy person of the group, Joey. What are your thoughts and your relationship to this film, and also to Lenny Bruce as a sort of titan of comedy?
Yeah, so for the record, so it's stated right off the bat, I'm not the biggest fan of Bob Fosse's films. I don't really like Cabaret. I don't really like this film, and I don't like Star 80. That leaves All That Jazz, which I think is his masterpiece. I do really appreciate that film. So his sense of direction, while very different from something like what he's really known for to the average movie-going audience, which is Cabaret and All That Jazz, this couldn't have been like a bigger departure for him. I mean, even his first one, which I believe was Sweet Charity, is so different from what's going on here. So I going into this and revisiting this, I was like, great, it's a Fosse film. Ugh, okay. So there was that. Now, the film as a whole, I think, is very interesting because My favorite decade of film are the 1970s. I don't think it's ever been topped. It's never been bottomed. It's never been anything. And it is a brilliant decade of film, not only for American film, but for foreign film as well. This year, as Erik said, is a fantastic year. You know, we have some real titans in the form of Chinatown and The Godfather Part II, and say what you want about it, myself included, we'll talk crap about it, but something like Murder on the Orient Express. You know, you had these big movies this year. And then you had something like Lenny, which was small and intimate and very much shot in a documentary style way, and which I can appreciate. I don't think the movie is great. I think it actually really lacks from being interesting, which is a big shame because Lenny Bruce was a titan. He was and is known in the comedy world as a masterful god. You know, I started doing stand-up comedy 4 years ago in Cleveland, and really took a lot of inspiration through the people like Lenny and Joan Rivers and Don Rickles and Elaine May, and, you know, like people who just didn't give a shit and would say what was on their mind and really knew how to take uncomfortable situations and make them funny, because I'm a person who believes that anything is funny. You can joke about anything in the world, but it has to work. You know, there are some people, as you know, we are all queer people here, who we fondly remember someone like Kevin Hart trying to say, make that joke a couple years ago about, you know, if you ever found his son playing with dolls, he'd, you know, smash the dollhouse over his head. And he's like, it's a joke. It's a joke. That's not funny. You know, there's no punchline there. Yeah, you can joke about something like that, but what he did essentially wasn't joking. He just was talking about, you know, causing harm and violence because his kid could be queer. That's not how you do that. And Lenny Bruce, Don Rickles, etc., could talk about that and make something like that funny, I truly feel. So yes, you can make anything funny. You have to know how to do it. Lenny Bruce is that person. That's why I love him. So I think for being such an interesting person, this movie really doesn't dive into that. And I think the better Lenny Bruce is honestly on Mrs. Maisel. So what about you, Erik?
Yeah, go ahead, Erik. Joey's just taking over.
God, whose show this was.
I agree with some of the things you said, especially about anything can be made funny if the joke is right, if the context is right, and the audience is right. And I think that's one of the biggest components. And you brought up Kevin Hart, and he made that joke, you know, with an audience of people that already love him, that might already kind of think that way. So it wasn't like a really progressive joke. It was a really safe and regressive joke while being, you know, ugly at the same time, which is very different than something like Lenny Bruce or George Carlin would do, which would be to challenge his audience, their audience. They both did that all the time. And that, to me, is one of the greatest things about this era of comedians, which actually is also this era of film. The 1970s just blew apart all of the last decades, from like Hays Code all the way up to the very late 60s, of what we could say in film, what we could say on stage. It's such a great era. And I think something like Lenny completely takes advantage of that. Unlike you, though, I'm a huge fan of this movie. I think it's amazing. It is the Cassavetes style of sort of pseudo documentary, weird angle look to it, I think is pretty perfect for it. I really love that it's nothing like any other Bob Fosse film. I understand your thought that it doesn't delve into Lenny Bruce as much as you'd want it to, and I would agree with that, because it is very kind of just on the surface of here's what happened, lots of courtroom stuff, maybe too much courtroom stuff, because that's my least favorite Dustin Hoffman, is the courtroom stuff, Kramer versus Kramer 2. But everything else about his Lenny Bruce, I think, is flawless. I think it's his best performance, and he's hot as shit in this. But I like the style. I think the style works for this. It's off-putting and it's a little aggressive, but then at the same time, every time you have a stand-up sequence, you very much feel like you are there in both the humor of it and laughing with it, and also the really uncomfortable stuff, like when he goes on the big racial slur tirade, but you also understand exactly what he's doing in it. So I am a huge fan of this movie.
Yeah. It's funny for me watching this again shortly after watching Nashville, which was the last On Second Thought episode. Shout out to Sam Meltzer, who pointed out this connection too on Letterboxd. There's a rawness here, especially with the use of sound, that is very analog. It sounds like how a person really sounds in a room. The echo, the cinematography, the editing. It has the same kind of a raw, natural feeling of a Nashville, and you also see a lot of the influence of European cinema, I think, French New Wave stuff with how it looks unpolished, but it's also very meticulously put together at the same time. And it really does feel like we are almost watching real footage in spots of Lenny and even of Honey. I do think it's a good approach to the material. When you have these films that are about larger than life figures or people who are subversive and provocative, it always feels a little wrong when the film itself about them is conventional. And, I'm talking very directly about something like Bohemian Rhapsody, where Freddie Mercury was such a flamboyant, over-the-top kind of performer and artist, and the film about him just does not really honor that in terms of the visual language or any of the directorial flourishes. Whereas here, I do think that Bob Fosse does understand Lenny Bruce, at least as an artist versus your day-to-day life, and how different those two experiences can be. And I do think that does inform how the film plays out in the bouncing back and forth between those performing scenes and the real life scenes where he's just depressed and he's having these conflicts with Honey and, dealing with the obscenity charges. And there's something kind of exhausting about those scenes. And then you compare that to him performing and the spotlight's on him, and he totally has the audience in the palm of his hand, usually. And you see, I think, why he would become really addicted to sort of chasing that high. I love the sort of metatextual aspect there, which I actually do think is a little similar to his approach with All That Jazz later, which is the sort of the high of performing, but then also how exhausting it is to be a performer at the same time. There's the behind the scenes of Bob Fosse himself editing this film while he's also, building this musical Chicago, doing these things at the same time to the point of passing out from exhaustion. That energy is weirdly felt in the film itself.
Yes.
I totally agree. I love the comparison that you mentioned to Cassavetes, because I don't know about you guys or what your favorite Cassavetes film is, but mine is Faces, and there's a lot of Faces inspiration I feel in this film, which is such a shame to me because I love Faces, and then I'm like, I see this one and I'm like, ooh, okay.
I mean, I get that. I love Faces too, but I could definitely see it, that it's a little bit aping the style in some ways. I personally, A Woman Under the Influence from this very year is the tops for me. But
yeah, it's so committed to the style and it never breaks from it, and I really appreciate that. And to your point, Kevin, about the sort of French New Wave element, the whole sequence, the lesbian sequence with Valerie Perrine, feels completely like the Sharon Tate French movies, and it just has that feeling, and it's so extremely, quite literally, voyeuristic in that moment too. And it is really one of the few times that things are quiet, absolutely quiet, and take its time, versus the rest, which is pretty frenetic. Whether it's the interview-like conversations or whether it's the stand-up, it's just a quiet moment, and there are very few of those in the movie.
Yeah. I also want to dive down a little more into these two performances that are at the center. With Dustin Hoffman, Erik mentioned that it's his best performance possibly. I don't know if I would quite go on that level, but I think he definitely captures a certain energy about Lenny Bruce. Doesn't really look like him very much. Again, going back to the Maisel comparison, Luke Kirby probably is closer in that regard, but I remember talking about his performance on the episode of How Did They Win about the 1974 Best Actor race and how he really does have the essence of him in some ways. This is a performance where I do see Dustin Hoffman more than I truly see him becoming a different character. And some of the bigger moments, perhaps like the courtroom scenes that are grandstanding and like the I'm acting kind of style that he had in a lot of performances in this era. I can't say that I would give him a win for this necessarily, but there is this blending that I think he does really well, which is believing in his own hype, but then also having like a real self-loathing happening at the same time that is very specific, and it's a very fine line. But I do think that that's where he excels, is in having that classic sort of artist dynamic of wanting to express what he needs to express, but then also feeling kind of bitter and kind of empty at the same time. For as much as Bob Fosse is a good fit for this material, I also think Dustin Hoffman, like at this specific time period of him really kind of being a control freak and, you know, acting up on set, would naturally lend itself to something like Lenny Bruce, I would say.
Yeah.
I find it very. So wait, Erik, are you saying this is like, or I almost said Pacino? Are you saying this is Hoffman's best nominated performance, or like his best performance in your opinion?
I think it's one of his very best performances, and it's really it's the stand-up stuff for me, because it never. I get Kevin's point that it feels like, you know, Dustin Hoffman, but I also agree that I feel like he completely has the essence, and I can lose myself in a biopic where the person doesn't look exactly like the person if I feel that they have the essence of that person. I'll go all in. And all of the stand-up never feels anything less than completely authentic. And some of it is, as we know from the history. It's so convincing, and it never misses a beat. And when you're doing something like stand-up or like Shakespeare, sorry, Joey, it requires a cadence and a pattern, and you can't miss it. And I don't think he misses it at all, ever. It always feels completely authentic. And I think it is a really good match for Hoffman's energy. And like Kevin said, for that period, it just, sometimes you hit the, you know, right director, right actor, right moment in a career and in a time where it just, all the pieces come together in a way that they only could have with that combination.
Thank you for listening to this preview of On Second Thought, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes, a Slack channel, and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.